Good morning. Today I'm going to tell another story about ocean racing, which has been a lifelong passion of mine. A couple of days ago I spoke about a transatlantic race that I sailed many years ago, which was 3,600 miles long, taking us from Bermuda to Denmark. It took 20 days. Today's story is about Don Crowhurst, an Englishman who entered a non-stop, round-the-world race for single-handed sailors. That's about 8 times longer than the transatlantic race that I raced in, and it's the strangest sailing story I've ever encountered. 2 movies about Crowhurst were released in England in 2018. So let's start by watching the trailer for one of them.
Dreams are the seeds of action. We'd all do well to remember that. A single-handed race around the world. I've already sent in my entry form.
Are you serious?
Alone on a boat for 9 months. You're either drunk or mad. Well, we should have another drink so that we can rule out madness.
May I point out you don't have a boat capable of such a voyage?
We're going to build one.
Have you ever done anything like that before?
That's the point. If I can do it, then so can the bloke who stares at the horizon.
I'm putting in the money. What are you putting in?
Everything else.
I fooled myself into thinking we were just building a boat. I didn't think I'd actually have to watch you sail away.
That's what boats do.
Promise me you'll come home.
Any sane man would want to pull out of such an endeavour. Leave your doubts with us here on the shore. Take your dreams out to sea.
A great deal of pressure falls on the man alone on a boat. The sea shows no mercy.
Where are the leaders?
3,000 miles ahead.
If I go on, my chances of survival would be 50-50. If I turn back, I face certain ruin.
I can't go on, and I can't go home. So where else is there?
I'm here. What if I tell them I'm here?
This week, Don Crowhurst has been posting some remarkable speed.
What do I do now?
A new single-handed record!
I'm out here alone!
I thought I could play the game better. Don Crowhurst wanted to be famous. Now he's about to be.
We had a hand in this. We put pressure on the man.
Always connected, no matter how far apart we are.
Tomorrow, and every day after, my children will still need their father. And I will still need my husband.
Life must be lived. So the question becomes, what can you do to give it all meaning?
Crowhurst's story is a long and complicated one. A good way to start is to look at a headline that appeared in Crowhurst's hometown newspaper. It's full of excitement about the grand welcome being planned for Crowhurst's victorious homecoming. It reported within a week, Donald Crowhurst, the apparent winner of a round-the-world sailboat race, is expected to arrive back in Teignmouth, where he started the race 10 months ago in his 40-foot trimaran. Crowhurst was one of 9 entrants in the Golden Globe race. This was the first non-stop, single-handed, around-the-world race, and it was sponsored by the Sunday Times of London. The racers had to do a complete circumnavigation of the world without using the Suez or Panama canals. This chart shows the route that the racers would have to take. Entrants could start any time between June 1st, 1968 and October 31st of the same year, and they could start from any port in the British Isles. The date range was chosen to avoid harsh winter conditions in the North Atlantic. The world had been circumnavigated since the days of Magellan. However, in 1967, Sir Francis Chichester completed a single-handed circumnavigation in his 53-foot Gypsy Moth 4, making just one stop in Australia. And that feat caused great excitement. He completed the 28,500-mile journey in 226 sailing days. That works out to an average of about 126 miles of sailing per day. His book about the voyage became a huge bestseller and captured the public's imagination, especially in Great Britain. Here you see Gypsy Moth 4, where she is on permanent display in Greenwich, England. By 1968, several adventurers had announced plans to undertake single-handed circumnavigations without making any stops. The Sunday Times decided to capitalize on this by sponsoring a race. Here's the official notice that the Sunday Times published, and I'll read it. The £5,000 Sunday Times Round the World Race Prize will be awarded to the single-handed yachtsman who completes the fastest non-stop circumnavigation of the world, departing after June 1st and before October 31st, 1968, from a port in the British mainland, and rounding the three capes, Good Hope, Leeuwin, and Horn. There were other rules imposed on the racers. They could not receive any outside physical assistance, and after they started, no fuel, water, food, or equipment could be taken aboard. And of course, since it was a sailboat race, they couldn't use their engines other than to charge their batteries. A useful map for understanding the course is this view taken by looking above the South Pole in Antarctica. The three capes mentioned in the time notice are shown here. This is the only possible route to sail around the world without using the Panama and Suez canals. And the seas between these capes are called the Southern Ocean. This chart shows the prevailing winds found in various latitudes of the Earth. In the southern hemisphere, the further south one sails, the stronger the prevailing winds are. So the latitudes in the 40s are called the Roaring 40s. And then in the 50s, they're called the Furious 50s because except for Cape Horn, there are no land masses that stand in the way of the winds and seas. Below Cape Horn are the Screaming 60s. So the Southern Ocean was the racers' biggest challenge. In addition to the extreme winds and seas of the Southern Ocean, there were other challenges. If you're sailing single-handed, when you're sleeping, you can easily be run over in the open ocean since big ships aren't expected to look for small boats. Prior to the introduction of the Global Positioning System in 1990, there were few ways to navigate on the open ocean other than using a sextant to observe the sun, moon, stars, and planets. This is a complicated task and can only be acquired with experience navigating on the ocean. At the time the race was held, weather forecasting often wasn't available for the sparsely traveled areas of the globe. And radio communications over long distances can be difficult, and of course require electricity, or the radios do, and therefore you need a working engine to charge batteries. Finally, having sufficient food aboard for a 9-month voyage requires careful planning and storage, including ways to keep the food fresh. As the race got underway in the summer of 1968, there were 9 starters. However, by November, 5 boats had dropped out. So in this talk, I want to concentrate on the remaining 4 competitors, although there are 2 dropouts that do deserve mention. John Ridgway was 29 and racing a 30-foot fiberglass boat. He was the first competitor to start on June 1st, the earliest allowed date, but his boat began to buckle, forcing him to drop out and sail to Brazil. And after he dropped out, he wrote in his logbook that he had cried for the previous 27 days in a row. Prior to the race, he had successfully rowed across the Atlantic with another man. Shea Blythe was the man who had rowed across the Atlantic with Ridgway. And he had a 30-foot boat like Ridgway's with twin keels. But what's amazing is he didn't know how to sail or navigate. He had 1 6-hour sailing lesson before setting off around the world. For navigation, he just brought along books to learn as he sailed. He made it as far as South Africa, but dropped out after encountering severe gale winds. Amazingly, 2 years later, he sailed nonstop around the world, doing it in the westbound direction, which is much more difficult than sailing eastbound. So Shea Blythe was certainly a competitor. Now let's talk about the 4 remaining competitors in the order in which they departed. Robin Knox Johnson was a British merchant marine captain with extensive sailing experience. He had a 32-foot ketch built in India of teak. This made it very heavy and slow, but he had sailed from India to England without any problems. He started the race on June 14th from Falmouth, England. Bernard Moitessier was a Frenchman who grew up in Vietnam. He was a very experienced ocean sailor who had sailed this boat, Joshua, nonstop from Tahiti to Spain via Cape Horn. His 45-foot ketch was strong. It was made of steel boilerplate. He started the race on August 22nd from Plymouth. Nigel Tetley was 45 and had just retired as a Royal Navy officer. He was a longtime sailor and experienced ocean racer. His boat was a 40-foot trimaran that he lived on. He started the race September 16th from Plymouth. Now, multi-hull sailboats like a trimaran are significantly faster than monohull boats, except if sailing into the wind. Off the wind, their hulls can plane over the seas, which a monohull isn't able to do. The big concern is if they capsize, it can be very challenging to get the boat upright again, especially if you're alone. Finally, there was Don Crowhurst, the mystery man, a weekend sailor who talked a good game. He was an electronics entrepreneur and boasted of having an onboard computer. His boat was also a trimaran, whose hulls were identical to Tetley's. He had thought a lot about the problem of capsizing and had a bag at the top of the mast which could be inflated in order to right the boat, all supposedly controlled by his computer. However, he never really got the system going. He started the race on October 31st, the last allowed day, from Teignmouth, his hometown. His boat was nowhere near ready, and he was well aware of that, but the race rules required him to start that day, and he did. Although Crowhurst put on a brave face while scrambling to get his boat shipshape, he was plagued with doubts about whether he and his boat were up to the task. Many years later, his widow related his state of mind the night before he set off to sail around the world alone.
You think, well, I didn't stop him, and I should have done. But last night at Teignmouth, he did weep for a long time in our bedroom. I knew that it would be very easy to say, don't go. That's the awful thing, you know you could stop it. And yet you know that it could be disastrous if you did.
Now, let's pick up the story in December. 9 boats had started by the October 31st deadline, but by November, 5 had dropped out. Let's take a look at how the 4 boats still in the race were doing in December. This is the same South Pole view of the Southern Ocean, and I've marked the positions of the 4 competitors. Robin Knox Johnson started June 14th and was still in the lead. He had passed the South Island of New Zealand on November 20th, and by mid-December, he was halfway to Cape Horn. Moitessier had started over 2 months later, but had been catching up quickly. On Christmas Day, he was approaching the South Island of New Zealand, and Tetley had started 4 weeks after Moitessier, and in early November, he had passed Cape Town. Crowhurst had given vague and conflicting reports of his position, but on Christmas Eve, he told his wife he was somewhere off Cape Town. However, on January 19th, he reported a position near Go Island, which is 1,300 miles west of Cape Town. After January 19th, there was radio silence from Crowhurst. He reported that he was having trouble charging batteries and therefore didn't think he'd be able to use his radio. So to summarize, at this point, Knox Johnson was well on his way to Cape Town, with Moitessier not far behind in a substantially faster boat. Cape Horn is a key waypoint in this race. Once a competitor rounds Cape Horn, they're able to leave the fierce winds of the Southern Ocean and turn north for the run home through the Atlantic Ocean. The cash prize was based on the fastest elapsed time between an entrance start date and finish date. So perhaps Crowhurst was still a contender since he started on October 31st. Keep in mind, Knox Johnson had started 4.5 months before Crowhurst, and Motissier started 2 months before Crowhurst. Now, here are the dates that they rounded Cape Horn. Knox Johnson rounded on January 17th. Motissier rounded on February 5th. And Tetley rounded the Horn on March 18th. Crowhurst isn't listed because he wasn't heard from until April 9th, when he broke radio silence and gave a vague position report. Based on Crowhurst's report, the race organizers predicted that Crowhurst might round Cape Horn April 18th, a month after Tetley. Motissier was doing very well. After starting 69 days after Knox Johnson, he was only 19 days behind him rounding Cape Horn. Motissier carried audio and video equipment with him and filmed Cape Horn as he rounded it. However, if we listen to his narrative, you'll see that he hints he doesn't want to finish the race. Here's a portion of Motissier's
Bernard
video.
Motissier had now been alone at sea for nearly 6 months, and the isolation was beginning to affect him profoundly.
After Cape Horn, I felt anew. I didn't want to come back. You see, it didn't seem worth it. I could feel it. I didn't say so to anyone. I didn't dare to. I hardly dared admit it to myself.
Bernard Motissier.
Jumping ahead, here's the situation in mid-April. Knox Johnson is approaching England and close to finishing. Motissier is a special case that I'll talk about in a moment. Tetley had made good progress and was off Brazil, about to pass Rio de Janeiro. This chart is in French, but you'll see that it indicates 2 positions for Crowhurst. His declared position, which is approaching Cape Horn, and his real position past Cape Horn. So what's going on here? Due to the rush of meeting the October 31st starting date cutoff, Crowhurst sailed without certain key equipment, including important items like hoses for his bilge pumps. Within his first month at sea, he realized the boat was already falling apart. 15 days after starting, he was already having thoughts of quitting the race. Late in November, he changed his method of making entries in his logbook, and on December 2nd, he decided to start keeping a second logbook, his real logbook. As he was sailing towards South Africa, Crowhurst became convinced that the chances of his boat surviving the Southern Ocean were 50-50 at best. But just dropping out of the race was not a simple solution for Crowhurst. He had sponsors, and more important, he had signed a note forfeiting his business to one of the sponsors if he didn't complete the race. He didn't have to win the race, he just had to finish. In December, he started calculating fake positions covering the rest of the race course. This was a very complicated process in which he would have to figure out fake sextant readings, make the calculations to translate the sextant readings to positions, and so on. Perhaps as a distraction, on December 11th, he reported by radio that he had sailed 243 miles in one day, which would break a record for solo sailors. After that, he only radioed a very few vague positions and made his last transmission on January 19th. So, for example, in December, his actual position, seen in the top part of the slide, was close to the coast of Brazil. But as depicted in the bottom part, he had vaguely claimed to have gone around the Cape of Good Hope by that time. Crowhurst had made a decision to not even try sailing in the Southern Ocean. On this map, you see Crowhurst's voyage in red, whereas the blue track that you see is the track someone would follow who was actually following the race course. Crowhurst had decided to just stay in the Atlantic and wait for the others. He even stopped in a remote Argentinian port to make repairs and luckily a lax harbor master never reported him to his superiors, because that stop would have disqualified him from continuing in the race. His plan was to rejoin the race at the tail end after Tetley rounded Cape Horn. Staying off the radio for 2.5 months gave him the cover to reappear. He figured that when he finished the race as an also-ran, he would escape scrutiny. By safely staying in the Atlantic, he'd be able to return to his family and not lose his business.
In 2 months' time, the race route would bring the other sailors around Cape Horn and past him. At that point, he could slip in beside them and sail for home. Until then, he could only wait. He'd stopped all radio communication to avoid detection. His isolation was complete.
2 prizes had been offered. The Golden Globe was just a trophy that would be given for the first boat to actually finish, no matter when it started. And there was no question Knox Johnson would win this. The 5,000-pound cash prize was for the boat with the fastest elapsed time. Motissier started August 22nd and had a much faster boat than Knox Johnson. He caught up enough that he would likely be the elapsed time winner. Tetley, starting on September 16th, might still be in the running because his boat was a trimaran and potentially faster than Motissier. For his purposes, all Crowhurst had to do was rejoin the race behind Tetley and stay behind him. So, as Knox Johnson was getting close to finishing in England, here's where the world thought the other three competitors were. Motissier was passing Rio de Janeiro. Tetley was off Argentina, having passed the Falkland Islands, and Crowhurst was supposedly approaching Cape Horn, shown on the map as claimed. Although we know now he'd been waiting around off Argentina, shown as the actual position in this map. And Robert Knox Johnson did indeed finish on April 22nd, and he won the Golden Globe trophy. Here you see the newspaper headline and a nice painting of his small boat. However, based on the position of the other 3 boats, it was almost impossible that Knox Johnson could win the elapsed time cash prize. Then something extraordinary happened. Upon reaching Cape Horn, Motissier had found the race so satisfying that he decided to keep sailing around the world rather than sailing to the finish line. And so off Brazil, he turned south toward the Cape of Good Hope. This film clip from a film called Deep Water describes what Motissier did and gives some idea of his state of mind as he describes his need to find peace by staying on the ocean.
After 7 months at sea and barely 6 weeks from home, Motissier abandoned the race and turned south again. He was sailing on around the world a second time.
I do not know how to explain to Françoise and the children my need to continue towards the Pacific, to be at peace. I know I'm right. I feel it deeply. I know exactly where I'm going. How could they understand that? It is so simple that it can't be explained in words.
Sometimes at the end of, say, a Bermuda race, Ted Turner didn't want to return to land. He wished he could be like the Flying Dutchman and just get on another boat. And at least once, as we were coming into Bermuda, Ted was reduced to tears. Motissier eventually stopped in Tahiti, having sailed a total of 45,000 miles non-stop. The dynamics of the race had now changed, with Motissier out of the race. Knox Johnson had finished, and only Tetley and Crowhurst remained. And in all likelihood, one of them would take the remaining 5,000-pound prize. On May 10th, Crowhurst sent a telegram, "No chance overtake Tetley." Crowhurst was trying to reduce any expectations of his winning, and of course he was going to make sure that he let Tetley win.
After 7 months,
Then another extraordinary thing happened. Tetley was so worried that Crowhurst might catch him that he pushed his boat too hard, and Tetley's boat sank. Because now Johnson had a 4.5-month head start, that meant that when he finished, Crowhurst would have the best elapsed time and win the 5,000-pound prize. It was everyone's dream come true, his family, his sponsors, his town, but it was Crowhurst's worst nightmare. As the winner, his logbook and charts would be carefully examined, and inevitably, Crowhurst's fraud would be exposed. Recall the headline we saw at the beginning of the talk about his home port preparing for the big victory celebration. That article had reported, within a week, Donald Crowhurst, the apparent winner of a single-handed non-stop around-the-world sailboat race, is expected to arrive back in Teignmouth, where he started 10 months ago. This headline appeared one day later, after that first headline. RMV Picardy found the trimaran Teignmouth Electron adrift and abandoned about 700 miles southwest of the Azores. Although the boat seemed in good condition, there was no sign of its skipper, Donald Crowhurst. After finding his abandoned trimaran, a cursory search was made for Crowhurst. From the outset, Crowhurst had been plagued with doubts. In fact, he was first considered quitting November 15th. If he came home the winner and his fraud was discovered, his life would be ruined. In his real logbook, he wrote a long, rambling piece demonstrating his insanity. On the right, you can see Crowhurst's track from June 1st onward. This is the period after Tetley had sunk on May 21st, the event that had caused Crowhurst's dilemma. In this video clip, Crowhurst's widow reflects on what caused Crowhurst's final descent into insanity. We'll also hear some of Crowhurst's log entries in which he describes insights he was developing about God, the universe, and the space-time continuum, what many would consider the ravings of a madman.
He was in the most extraordinary feeling of, I failed everything. There was nobody there to talk to. He tried to contemplate ways of dealing with this race and the money and the family back home, and eventually his brain said, enough, no more.
Do we go on clinging to the idea that God made us, or realize that it lies within us to make God? By learning to manipulate the space-time continuum, man will become God and disappear from the physical universe as we know it.
Somehow he just had given up on his family. We had vanished from his mind at that stage.
Here we see a picture of the dirty dishes Crowhurst left in the sink, and a picture of his boat being offloaded from the ship that found it in the North Atlantic Ocean. At first, this seemed like another Bermuda Triangle mystery. Here's a picture of the interior of Crowhurst's boat when it was found. All his charts and logbooks, both fake and real, were found. Also, many audio and videotapes were found that he had made for his sponsors. Using these materials, a detailed reckoning of his fraud and madness were compiled and documented. And it leaves no doubt that Crowhurst had jumped overboard. So how did Crowhurst sink into this spiral of deception? What clues can we find? Let me pass on some biographical information about Donald Crowhurst. He was born in 1932 and grew up in India, and he was raised as a girl until age 8, apparently because his mother had always wanted to have a girl. The family moved back to England in 1947 after independence. His father lost his life savings in 1947 on a business that he owned in Pakistan, and his father died a year later, 1948, leaving the family impoverished. Donald had to leave school. Donald was described by many as bright and charming, and always handy. He had a great ability to fix things. He joined the Royal Air Force and learned to fly, and was an officer for 6 years, but was described in the Air Force documents as a compulsive risk taker and defier of authority. And he had to leave the RAF. He then became an officer in the Army, got training in electronics, but also left. Since 1956, he had worked as in electronics for small companies and as an entrepreneur. He married in 1957 and eventually settled in Somerset, where they had 4 children. I'm a sailor, and so of course I find Crowhurst's story fascinating. However, my academic field is psychology, so I'm very interested in the question of whether he was mentally ill. A 1979 book written about Crowhurst offers a complicated definition of something called paranoid grandiosity, taken from the Encyclopedia Britannica. But I've always liked the concept of Occam's razor. That is, always look for the simplest explanation. So I would offer 2 possibilities for consideration. The American Psychiatric Association publishes a manual specifying diagnostic criteria for close to 400 different mental disorders. If we take a look at the criteria for bipolar disorder, we find quite a few of these traits in Crowhurst's behavior. Inflated self-esteem and grandiosity, increased need for sleep, pressure to keep talking, flight of ideas, racing thoughts, distractibility, increase in goal-directed activities, and then more generally, excessive activities with a high potential for painful consequences. I've also taught a seminar on psychopaths, and oddly, the term psychopath doesn't even appear in the APA's diagnostic manual. Psychopaths are more a subject for the legal system, and there's no agreed-upon definition, but here's a list of some generally recognized traits. And these would include deceitfulness, lying, and so on, motivated to do what's best for self, disregard and violation of rules, lack of remorse or guilt, that's a big element of a psychopath, callousness and lack of empathy, and blaming poor performance on others. Although some of Crowhurst's actions might seem to fit here, I find it hard to conclude that he was a psychopath. Throughout his ordeal, as manifested in his real logbook, he was racked with guilt about what he found himself doing. I think he was also tortured by the effect that his ultimate choices would have on his family, his wife and 4 small children. Perhaps the best insight into Crowhurst's struggles came many years later from his widow, Claire Crowhurst. In this video clip, she describes the anger she still feels. Also, one of Donald's few close friends offers a comment.
Everyone and everything. I feel that I failed. I didn't stop him from going, and I didn't help him when he needed it. But people need to dream. I think Donald needed that. And he had a right to have it.
The crowd criticized him. The crowd mocked him.
With Tetley sinking and Moutissier sailing Tahiti and Crowhurst jumping overboard, that meant there was only one finisher in the race, Robin Knox Johnson. So Knox Johnson did end up winning the 5,000-pound cash prize, which he gave to the Crowhurst family. Now, here are some suggestions if you'd like to find out more about this incredible story. This first book, The Strange Last Voyage of Donald Crowhurst, was written in 1970 and gives a very detailed account of his experiences, not just the race, but also his mental breakdown. The authors had full access to his charts and logbooks, both the faked log and the real log. They also had access to the video and audio tapes found aboard the boat. The second book, A Voyage for Madmen, is a wonderful read. It describes the race and all of the participants, and it's full of fascinating details. Deep Water is a 93-minute film, and that's the film I took these clips from, and it's available to stream on Amazon. I found it to be a very complete and totally absorbing account of Crowhurst's voyage. I've enjoyed being able to give